You're listening to Past Imperfect, a global and Indian history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. While writing their books and articles, historians mostly rely on written sources. But what happens when they use photographs instead? Avrati Bhatnagar and Sumathi Ramaswamy are historians at Duke University, and they join us to provide some answers. They've recently edited a book on a remarkable series of photos capturing the Civil Disobedience Movement in Bombay in 1930 and 1931. These photos demonstrate one thing above all: how thousands of women joined nationalist protests not just as participants, but as leaders. Nearly a century after those photos were taken, we're finally appreciating the scale of female involvement in this stage of India's struggle for freedom. Thank you very much, Sumathi and Avrati, for joining us today on this 25th episode of our podcast, Past Imperfect. Your book, Photographing Civil Disobedience, is based on one specific album of photographs, something that is known colloquially as the Narsi album, that's kept in the Alkazi Collection in Delhi. Can you tell us more about the history and contents of the Narsi album and how you realized that it was something special?
Thank you so much, Dinyar, for having us both on this podcast. So let me begin by describing the album for you. This is a remarkable history. It contains around 245 photographs that were captured during the civil disobedience movement in colonial India. But what makes it really rare is the singular focus on how the movement unfolded within the city of Bombay between 1930 and 1931. That is the launch of the movement in March 1930 to roughly when Gandhi set sail to attend the Second Roundtable Conference in London in August 1931. Almost all the photographs have typewritten captions attached to them. Some of these captions are very detailed, introducing the individuals or identifying the specific cases and specific sites or events that were photographed. Others are sometimes vague, even misleading or incorrect. The spine of this bound album mentions its title, which is Collections of Photographs of Old Congress Party KL Nursi. And that is where the colloquial name Nursi album comes from, because it's devoted to somebody called KL Nursi, who we've not been able to identify who that is yet. The album itself is now part of the Alkazi Collection of Photography, which is based in New Delhi. And they acquired this object at an auction in London some decades ago. The art album was first brought to us by Rahab Alana. He's the curator of the Alkazi collection. And he first introduced it to Sumathi when she was in the middle of a major project on Gandhi and visual culture. And this is because the album is bookended by a couple of photographs of Gandhi. But what is interesting about the contents of this album is that most of the images are not about Gandhi or even the major leaders of the movement. Rather, they focus on the masses, the people of Bombay, and the scale of their participation in the civil disobedience movement. So, when I started my research for the visitation project, Sumathi mentioned this album to me, and I had the opportunity to go look at this album back in 2018. And then one thing led to another, and it was only in the summer of 2020 that Sumathi and I jointly started working on this project. And our goal with this project was really to uncover a people's history and an urban history of civil disobedience. And also, of course, a commitment to both academic and also public facing scholarship.
So, to recap, we don't know who took photos from this album, who put it together, what its provenance. But nevertheless, when both of you saw this album, you realized that it was something important and something special and something that needed to be shared with a wider audience.
Yes. So, and that is the interesting aspect of it. There is a lack of authority, so to speak, because we don't know the photographer, we don't have any information on who compiled this album, who wrote these captions, and yet then our approach became, instead of tracing, we are interested in the photographer, of course, and in identifying, a source for these photographs, but at the same time, then our research became more about letting the photographs speak for themselves and finding authority instead of in individuals in the visual itself. So the album speaks for itself. The photographs tell us a history and a story. And instead of giving us answers, they give us a lot of questions, which we then seek out in the images, but also in the texts and other kind of textual archives and other archives that are also produced during the
In addition to the book, the Narsi album is now the topic of two museum exhibits, one in Mumbai at the CSMVS Museum and one at Duke University. What do you hope will result from greater public interaction with these particular photographs?
So I'll take that on, Dinyar, and I wanted to add my thanks to Avratis as well for inviting us to your wonderful podcast series, which I've learned so much from over the years as a historian. I wanted to begin by first actually saying that we were both, because we are both committed to digital humanities as well, we had at first thought of this as a digital exhibit, both because it is a new and challenging thing to do for us as historians, and also because of the worldwide access that it would provide, of course, for all those who have affordable access to the internet. And such an object is still in the works. But meanwhile, as you well know, the idea for publishing the edited volume emerged, and we're really delighted with the edited book that we now have, thanks to our wonderful publishers, the Alkazi Collection of Photography in Delhi, in New Delhi, and Mappin in Ahmedabad. We have really appreciated the design of the book, which you have, of course, seen as well, and the effort to produce really high quality images and the care with which the entire team actually produced a quality work that we can be proud of, I think. But of course, most appreciative to other scholars who joined us on this amazing journey, in producing this book, historian of art Preeti Chopra, film and media studies scholar Debashri Mukherjee, and historians Kama McLean, Abigail McGowan, Murali Ranganathan, and you, of course, Dinyar, as well, with your fabulous essay in the volume. And from the start, I believe we were all committed to producing a book as a work of public history. And to get to your question about the exhibits, because the book actually began as a scholarly catalog, but it has really bloomed into a volume in its own right now. And we were all committed to writing in a manner, even though we are all, all of us are also professional academics. Murali may not see himself as such, but he really is one of us. And we wanted to write in a manner that is more accessible than the usual academic work, something that is not easy, I think, for us, but extremely important. At least for now, it's only in English, but it would be amazing if it gets translated into other languages in India. That would be an amazing next step to contemplate. So, public history and public visual humanities, I would say, are at the heart of the project and actually are the driving force behind the exhibits. At the CSMVS, a major public museum, as you know, in South Mumbai, and on our own campus, home campus, at the Duke Center for Documentary Studies in Durham, North Carolina. And it's really fitting, I think, that we have emphasized the publicness of this entire project because we see the photographs in the Nursi album as well as public objects in every sense of the term public, right? They capture a slice, for example, of Bombay's public sphere at a very important turning point in its history and the history of the country as well. Some of the photographs were published in their own time in public media, largely pro British, very ironically, news media such as the Times of India and the Illustrated Weekly of India. The album, to pick up on a point that Avrati made, was put together by a collator who may or may not have been Narsi. And we don't know whether he or she, well, he, certainly we think it's a man, did it for private or public ends. We don't know, in other words, the reason for the collation. Nor do we know if the album circulated in its own time as a public object, who got to see it, and so on. All of these are open questions that are exciting to contemplate. But it is interesting to think of the fact that we are, the collator of the album was also its first curator. So we are, in a sense, following in his footsteps or in their footsteps as we re engage with the album. So, in curating the exhibit in Mumbai and then, of course, at Duke, we saw, well, actually in Mumbai, I should say, we saw ourselves as returning these photographs to their public origins in the city, even while bringing these photographs to a new public in a US American context at Duke in North Carolina. And there's an abbreviated version of the show, I must say, at Duke. The Mumbai show is the big, first show, so to speak. So we're very hopeful that the new publics in India, as well as those who come through Durham to see it, will become part of the public history of this album, and that's very exciting to contemplate.
And I should mention, for those people who are able to visit the exhibit in Mumbai, you're able to see the actual album, right? That's kept in an alcove. And when I first saw the actual album, I was surprised and shocked by how small it was, right? It's this small little object that's, no bigger than, say, the size of maybe a laptop, right? And yet it contains so much stuff inside of it. And Avrati, you mentioned how the album is bookended by images of more famous people like Gandhi and others. But what else is in it? I mean, can you describe some of the most striking photos? I mean, there are many, obviously, striking photos in this work, but what, in your opinion, are some of the most outstanding images that are conveyed in this album?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dinyar. And I would say it's a rather difficult question. Difficult because, like you said, it's hard to pick which photographs are the most striking. And in some ways, it resonates with the difficult choices that we had to make when we were during the process of curation, when we were selecting which images should go up in the gallery and which not. But the first set of images that I would say were the most interesting are the ones that Sumathi, in her chapter called Salt Lessons, because these are images where you see women. So during the process of the satyagraha, you see women sort of going to the seashore, collecting salt water and coming back. And then there are these photographs which show there's a group sitting together, and the women are being instructed how to boil salt water in order to produce salt, which was very interesting because these are middle class women who do not necessarily need to be taught how to boil water in order to and use a chula or a stove. And yet you see these nationalist men directing them in a series of photographs on how to do these basic core. And then there's these lotas, sigris, these very common household objects that turn into these tools of disobedience. So that set was really interesting. Another set of very interesting photographs or compelling photographs are the ones in which you see the city of Bombay and these very important and magnificent, really, imperial buildings in the backdrop. And in the front of the photographs or the foreground of the photographs, there's a crowd which has taken over the street. So you see this transformation of an imperial city into a nationalist city, which makes a visual argument for the kind of transformation that is taking place in the ways in which the city itself is imagined or seen, or the way in which the people of Bombay are relating to the city or sort of recovering a new history, recovering the way in which they occupy the city. Of course, then there are photographs of police violence, which are striking. And I will speak about it more. I can speak about it more when I talk about police violence, because there are these photographs that show extreme police brutality. And you see these mentioned in textual archives, but the way in which the photographers capture this and the kind of angles that this trained, in my opinion, documentary photographer is using in order to show the extent to which the colonial Raj was a Lathi Raj, really. So these are some of the interesting and striking photographs that come to my mind. Of course, then there are women leading processions and marching on the streets and establishing a new relationship with the city. And this resonates with the ways in which we've curated the exhibition in these different sections, which speak to the city, to women's participation, to salt making, to police violence. And of course, then there are big nationalist leaders, which I've already mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different themes that are evoked in this particular album. I mean, when we talk about, say, the urban fabric of Bombay, I mean, one of the most striking images, in my opinion, is of Fitzgerald Fountain, which has actually just recently been restored in Dobi Talao in Bombay. And there nationalist protesters were just basically piled on top of each other, sitting on top of the fountain and taking part in a protest. So it really is in many ways kind of looking at the colonial fabric of the city, the physical fabric, and seeing it in a whole different dimension, which is fantastic, in terms of being able to visually understand how the city was going through so much change. That leads me to my next question. Both of you are historians who work with visual material. I do not. I am completely ignorant. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what photographs can do as source material that, other material like written sources cannot.
I can take that on, Dinyar. And first, I wanted to say I was delighted to drag you into this visual project and set you on your journey as a visual historian. I hope you make that turn, just as I did many now, a couple of decades ago.
It definitely encouraged me to do so, yeah.
Yes, and you have, of course, done a great job. I love your piece and the volume and the way you've used the photograph. But you ask a very important question about the way historians use the photograph as opposed to, say, an art historian would, right? And of course, I and Avrati operate in this wonderful interdisciplinary space of visual culture, which allows us to sort of be a little promiscuous, if I can use the term, in the way we approach the image. And, picking up on the conversation already, I want to say this entire project is powered by the force of what we call the force of the historical photograph. And we have sort of argued this in the introduction to our volume. And which means that in contrast to the way that we normally, we as historians would go about our work in the project, we lead with the photograph and really lean into the photograph, I should say, and then see what other images come, a particular photograph may be in dialogue with, and what kind of constellations that emerge along the lines that Avrati was talking about when we try to figure out the curation for this project. So, by leading with the image, we are, of course, aiming to take the viewer down a different path than the ones that we would normally take in a textual archive, where such something may not be deemed important because it is, of course, the work of the image. The camera brings into view what catches its eye, so to speak. For example, the manner in which a policeman pauses over a volunteer or a satyagrahi before bringing down the lathi on him. We too take a pause and dive deep into that photograph to see what it reveals. And that might not be something you will find at all, that kind of nuance in the textual archive at all. So this is for me has been, as a historian, I have been so drawn to photography's great capacity to interrupt, as I call it, and redirect our attention to open up completely new points of view, literally, that we may not be aware of at all if we are only immersed in the textual archive. And I say this because I do not want to be, want to really emphasize this, that we are not making an argument in doing this for the sovereignty of the image or the autonomy of the image. Rather, we, I think, want to suggest that visual history involves a shuttling back and forth between the world of the image and the world of words. And this act of shuttling, produces new interpretations, new questions, new meanings to any image that we are looking at. And of course, we are not the only ones making such arguments or following such a method. In our work, we have been deeply influenced, and I'm speaking for myself really, but also I think for Avrati, and she can chime in if she has others she wants to name, but really influenced by those who work at the intersection of historical and cultural studies and the history of photography and theories of photography. And I want to just mention a few in the interest of time: the historian, the anthropologist, I should say, Elizabeth Edwards and Christopher Pinney, the art curator and theorist Ariella Azoulay, and the French philosopher and art critic Georges Didi Huberman. And in fact, Didi Huberman has provided us the inspiring prompt for this project in the curated versions, with his provocative comment: we often ask too much or too little of the image. And what did he mean by this? He argued that when we see a photograph, especially because of the technomaterial conditions of its production, it is, after all, doing this kind of indexical work of recording everything that is placed before it, apparently diligently and with great fidelity. We expect the photograph to tell the whole truth, and then are inevitably disappointed when we don't see it, when we don't find the whole truth. And so then we end up by dismissing it as inadequate, fake, false, and so on and so forth. Or else, as he suggests, we ask too little. And this is what I think historians typically do. We treat the photograph as purely illustrative, reflecting mutely what is presented, placed in front of it, instead of considering it as, in its full historicity, its specificity, its own conditions of existence, and most importantly, the argument it is framing, right? So that's a very important prompt with which we have worked both in the project and I would say even in the volume. I think we have that, that dialogue going on in the work. And so many of us in the volume, as you know, are historians. And inspired by Azule, and this goes back to a very important point that Avrati made at the very start. We have, stopped ourselves from going down the rabbit hole of figuring out who is this amazing photographer. I mean, it would be amazing for a future scholar to figure figure this out and bring that history as well. But we have sort of, hesitated to do that. And instead, picking up again on this very interesting point she made about the authority of the photograph itself, we have drawn on Azule's very important argument about what she calls the event of photography, that the very existence of a photographic image is an invitation for another event, its subsequent viewing and meaning making. So we've really focused on the afterlife as well of these photographs, of these images. What happens when photos taken in 1930 or 31 were encountered by a person who compiled the album, possibly K.L. Narsi, at some point afterwards. We've been fascinated by the individual who wrote the intriguing captions. We don't know who he was, or she was even. That would be tantalizing. The album made its journey, we have recently learned, to London, to an auction house, from where it was acquired by a New Delhi based archive, where we as historians first encountered these photographs. And then we, of course, in this project, returned these photographs to Mumbai to a new generation of viewers, right, who can engage with them and they visit the exhibit or when they read our book and so on. So there's this fascinating afterlife that these photographs and this album from almost 100 years ago can now, now lives, right, in our time. And that's also something really interesting to think about.
I want to turn from study of photography and the individual images to the historical context. So these photographs, of course, capture Bombay during the Civil Disobedience Movement. And in April 1930, the Bombay Chronicle, leading nationalist paper in the city of Bombay, described Bombay as, quote, a citadel of the national movement, end quote. Why do you think Bombay emerged as the hub of the civil disobedience movement, as opposed to, say, previous movements where, say, a city like Calcutta or other places like Ahmedabad were important loci of activity? And what factors do you think primed Bombay for such a public show of anti-colonial science that's so apparent when looking at any of these pictures?
That's a fantastic question, Dinyar. Thank you. So, and it really gets to the heart of the project in so many ways because I said we're very interested in recovering an urban history of civil disobedience. And we can trace it back to the fact that among the first to follow Gandhi's footsteps when he launched the civil disobedience movement were the people of Bombay. And Bombay had been a crucial port city within the Indian Ocean networks, but also for the British Empire. And this is especially since the opening of the Suez Canal in the late 19th century. So by 1930, Bombay is very well plugged into a global market in textiles, labor, and shipping. And the city then had both the infrastructure and the political appetite for rapid mobilization. For over a decade now, Bombay's native capitalists or merchant families had donated large sums of money to the nationalist cause, and the city was a key funding base for the anti-colonial movement. The and now when the movement is launched and the photographs that we see in the Narsi album and the singular focus on the city help us explore this relationship between a city, its people, and a political movement through a new and particularly compelling lens. As a historian, it pushed me to rethink the scale at which I engage with questions of nationalism. And the question becomes what becomes visible when civil disobedience is analyzed at the scale of the city. And what you see in the photos is a very modern colonial city with looming imperial architecture, which is caught in the process of becoming a nationalist city. You see spectacular boycott processions, which are coursing through these commercial arteries or roadways. There are crowds adjusting to women led pickets. There are tram lines, shop fronts, and police posts, which are really shaping the choreography of protest. And yet, I would say, and that is what makes Bombay so ripe for anti-colonial action because it is a commercial city, but also it's a city which is involved in politicization, sometimes because of its involvement in the commerce of the empire and of the emerging nation state. And but I would say that the images are also obscuring as much as they're revealing because this idea of Bombay being a nationalist city is important and interesting, but the exclusive focus also sort of takes away or leaves outside the frame other histories and other social movements and political movements that are also equally important for Bombay's history because Bombay has been a hub of communist led mobilization and mill workers' unions. And I'm thinking of the major 1928 strike, the great textile mill workers' strike in the city. But there's also B.R. Ambedkar, who's also functioning in the city and very, leading a movement of his own for the emancipation of the Dalit population. So there's this interesting, so Bombay in itself is, it's a multifaceted city. It has many textures, and it is one of the textures that becomes apparent in the pages of the Nursi album and which interests us. But we're also very cautious and cognizant of what the photograph is showing and not showing, and the kind of history of Bombay that is coming out of these pages.
I think that's a pretty important point because, the one area that's missing geographically in a lot of these photographs is what's colloquially known as Girangaon, right? The mill area. With the exception, if I remember, of one picture where there's a depiction of the BIT chawls, which, are currently being turned into high rises as we speak. But any representative image of Bombay from that period would highlight the textile mills, and they are completely missing. I think it's a really important point to make that a lot of stuff is obscured from this photographic record. But speaking on the longer history of photography in India, one of my particular frustrations whenever I work on Indian nationalism before 1930 is the lack of photographic evidence, right? I mean, this is especially true in the 19th century, where aside from those staid photos of someone looking very stiff in a camera who's, staring for a studio photograph, you don't get much. And every once in a while, you might encounter something. But even something like, say, the non-cooperation movement in the early 1920s, we have very little historical photographic records. I mean, we have drawings, we have images, but that's, we don't have much else, and definitely not the type of images that are portrayed in the Nursi album. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the long history of photography in India, both the highlights, maybe the lowlights, if we will, and the particularly deep and varied history of photography in a place like Bombay. I mean, after all, they were students at Elphinstone College learning about photography in 1858-59, right? And there was a photography club and a photography journal from that particular period. Can you tell us about this history and how the Narsi album fits into that history?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Dinyar. And I'll take that up and pick up on a very important point there, picking up on a point that Avrati made, which is Bombay was a key node, I would argue, in the globalization of photography, which is very important to remember. And here I'm really piggybacking on the scholarship of a number of people, but I'll pick for the moment, I'll stay with Chris Pinney, a scholar I deeply admire, who I already mentioned once. In his early body of work on photography, I mean, he was basically a major pioneering figure in this area, as far as I'm concerned. He was interested in the social life of photographs, as you know. But in his later writings, he became more interested in showing how the colonial camera functioned, as he put it, both as cure and as poison. So, what did he mean by this? On the one hand, the British colonial state really relied on the camera as one of its many tools of conquest, right? It was very important for surveilling people. It was important for creating visual stereotypes of, the various peoples of India. It was used to publicize, the camera was used to publicize the good work of empire, the schools that were established, the roadworks, the railways, the grand buildings, including the ones in Bombay. The camera also enabled the colonial state to present itself as a steward of India's inherited past, right? Amongst the most rich body of colonial photographs are photographs of India's temples, mosques, architectural sites, ruins, and so on. But most importantly, I think, because of the camera's indexical properties, or what we're seeing as its truth-telling capacity, the camera was used, and I'm really, picking up on Penny's point, the camera was used to show up the falseness of Indian ways of representing things. That, hey, we have now got this amazing truth-telling machine that calls out visual reality as it is, right? Rather than in these kinds of corrupt exaggerations and so on that allegedly flourished in the Indian visual realm. So it was a very important tool of conquest, command, control, and all of that. But remarkably, and this has intrigued me ever since I began to engage with photography as a historian, I ask myself, if this was such an important colonial tool, why did the colonial state not control its arrival, its circulation, its falling into the hands of the native? Exactly, as you noted, from very early on, from the 1850s. I mean, remarkably, right? Within almost a decade and a half of the invention of the camera in Europe, photography classes were being held in Elphinstone, and, a generation of native photographers was being produced. But Bombay is also famous for amazing photographers like Narayan Daji, Harichand Chintaman, Shivshankar Narayan, just to name a few. So, along with Calcutta and Madras, it was a really important node, as I mentioned, in the globalization of photography. And I love, this moment in our one of our dear contributors, Murali Ranganathan's early works when he translated Govind Narayan's Marathi memoir. He too has left his impressions of encountering the camera, which he uses the English word camera, which is interesting, but he calls it the power of sunlight. Again, he's captured that indexical property of this truth telling machine, right? And he marveled at what a simple but wonderful machine it was. And, Govind Narayan was also writing at this time, right? In the later, in the 1850s, 1860s, and so on. So this does not mean that when it finally fell into the hands of the native, and I really want to come to the point about nationalism and the camera, that immediately became an anti-colonial machine. That would be too simple and simplistic a reading, because we have generations of quote unquote native photographers resident in India, who were making images not unlike, what the Europeans were producing at the time. But it is the case that from the early years, I would say, of the 20th century, the camera was available not just to document the glorious work of empire, but also the atrocities and crimes. And an early moment, actually, was the massacre in 1919 at Jallianwala Bagh, which a Bombay photographer, N.V. Virkar, and Chris Penny has really documented this beautifully, produced all these dramatic photographs which showed the dark side of empire, the violent side of this empire, which apparently, brought Pax Britannica to India, right? And in fact, as the camera became lighter, cheaper, more mobile, and more Indians could afford it, it also left the studio. Studio photography was one of the most common contexts in which Indians got themselves photographed. And not just elites, actually. It was a very democratizing image making technology, which is why I think so many of us are attracted to its work. But it left the studio because of its mobility now and its lightness, went into the streets. And this is a consequential moment. Instead of men and women coming into the studio, now the photographer is reaching out to them. And this is where I would situate the Nursi album. Because the Nursi album is really, as I see it, an album off the street, about the streets of Bombay then. In fact, there are very few interior shots in this album. In fact, this is one of the things we also, the camera too has its silences, right? And we were very intrigued by this, that we don't get into homes at all. There are a couple places where, there are interior shots. There's a beautiful portrait. There's a beautiful early photograph of Nehru and Kamala sitting in some kind of a room in a very awkward, you know, in awkward, seating, very interesting, but very weird space. But there are very few interior shots. So this photographer stays resolutely on the streets outside these buildings, photographing the action. So that's a very important, I think, moment when when the camera becomes available and the street becomes interesting for its work.
There's one more thing I want to ask in that regard. So, yes, the camera was used as a colonial method to document and record. And, certainly we have lots of examples of that from the 19th century, the Peoples of India volume, right? Where you have each individual ethnic community or caste. And over there, the subjects are kind of very passive, right? I mean, they're looking away. They might not even, if they're looking at the camera, they're looking in a way that perhaps can only be described as being docile. But here in the Narsi album, we see something very different. We see many of the protesters, especially women, staring directly at the camera with a look of defiance. I wonder if you could talk more about that.
Did I take that on, Avrati? Okay. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the things that actually not just us, but we have noticed our students when they come through, we've got, at Duke, because it's a university context, so many classes are coming through. And the students comment on this as well. And this is so important to underscore to them that, yes, they're looking at the camera, but they're looking at a camera at a moment of enormous danger and risk to them because they have often just committed an illegal act, right? Illicit salt making or hoisting the flag or, encouraging the boycott of a store or something like that, or burning cloth or something like that, right? All of which were, potentially, they're criminal offenses, right? Capable of, them being corralled and sent to jail and so on. But they do not seem to get phased out at all. And they really want to be captured doing this. So that act itself is an act, contributes to what we are calling a disobedient act. And as you noted as well. But I think we may also want to get a little more granular about it. I think there is a way in which, some instances, there's a way in which I think the photographic subject is demanding recognition. Something along the lines of, hey, I am here, you need to pay attention to me. And, especially when this is about women, this is a very amazing gesture for us to recognize, right? In fact, this is beautiful photograph that Avrati has written so beautifully about, the Leelavati Munshi photograph standing in front of White Whale Laidlaw, this department store with a stylish, this absolutely stylish woman with a, lovely, purse under her arm. And the way she looks at the camera is really that. She's, of course, engaged in a disobedient act as well, but it's also like, hey, pay attention to me. And the camera does. And that's a very interesting thing as well. But I also want to say there are those who are looking at the back at the camera with a look of curiosity. That also you see. There are these photographs in which at the very edge you see somebody trying to get into the frame, wanting to be again captured, right? So there's all kinds of things happening in the way in which the resident of Bombay is engaging with the photographer in these photographs. And they're tantalizing for us to follow, I think.
And of course, the really big thing about these photographs is that there are just so many women portrayed in these particular images. It is in many ways, I think, the most remarkable aspect of this album. And that brings up a really important point. I mean, I know, Avrati, for example, your dissertation, you've looked in part at Desh Sevik, the organization of nationalist female volunteers. And I want to ask how these pictures help us rewrite not just the history of the civil disobedience movement, but Indian nationalism in general from the perspective of gender. And I think it's a particularly important historical moment to think about that, because obviously when Mahatma Gandhi begins his salt march from Ahmedabad to Dandi, he originally wants women not to be involved, right? Here, just a few weeks later, quite literally, you see an explosion of female participation in India's biggest and most cosmopolitan city.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you, Dina, for that question. Yeah, so you've got it absolutely right. Historians of India have long known or long established that the 1920s and 1930s are important, are critical for women's history in India because of the way in which Gandhi calls upon the women of India to participate in the nationalist movement and the unprecedented numbers in which women show up. But of course, even for historians, there were questions or doubts attached to this participation, which were women only acting according to the directions given by Gandhi, who's the patriarch, the quote unquote father of the nation? And where does women's autonomy lie in all of this? Were they just following men or were they acting of their own accord? This is basically a historiographical question that has bothered really gender historians or feminist historian for a while. And I think the photographs of the Nursi album give us some insight into how to answer these questions, or at least it most certainly makes these questions more complicated. And this happens, of course, through the degree of to which the visual narrative of the album centers the leading role played by women, and especially the members of the Desh Sevika Sangh. So the Desh Sevika Sangh is a citywide women's organization which is founded in the days leading up to the civil disobedience movement. So very much a response to Gandhi's call. And the Sevikas, as the members of the DSS often call themselves, were charged with this duty or responsibility to sustain the boycott of foreign goods and promotion of Swadeshi through propaganda and picketing of shops. And there's this very interesting episode when, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay meets Gandhi and says, and Gandhi tells her that, marching is not something that women should be doing. And these are not direct quotes. He says that marching is not part of what women's work should be. They should focus more on constructive activism. And Chattopadhyay sort of pushes back and says, let them do all of that, but also participate in direct action. And it's not weeks after this conversation, the very next day in Bombay, there is a group of around 500 women who march to the seashore, collect salt water, and, make illegal salt, which is something a day before Gandhi's telling Chattopadhyay not women should not be involved in. So this kind of disobedience towards, of course, the colonial state, but also towards the political scripts that nationalist leadership is handing down to women is part of the Desh Sevika Sangh and part of women's involvement in the civil disobedience movement since the beginning. And my take on this, or my argument, is that this is not just then allowing women to participate, become part of this larger nationalist movement, or become part of the nationalist history of the movement, but also allows them to establish a new and gendered relationship with the city. And it's really, and which is something that I'm exploring in this, my first monograph, or my first dissertation, my dissertation to book project, but I'm saying that, this is an emergence of a new kind of urban female political actor whose disobedience is constitutive of the nationalist movement, but it's also constitutive of the city and its marketplace because of their involvement in the boycott movement. And what is really exceptional, and we've already discussed this in the previous conversation that we were having before we started specifically talking about the DSS, is about the intentionality of women's presence when they're carrying out this program, when they're carrying water from seashore, picketing shops, or even leading marches, which are all of these activities are made unlawful by the colonial state. But the intentionality with which they pose for the photographer is one way in which we can understand them or see them as asserting themselves as political actors, not simply following directions that were given by men, but also taking charge and doing things, writing the political script themselves, asserting themselves as actors as opposed to simply subjects of the nation, or quote unquote handmaidens of the nation. Because if you think about it, the Desh Sevika Sangh literally translates as handmaidens or servants of the nation. But are these women really marching out of their houses to participate in these processions in the nationalist movement simply for the love of the nation? Or is it also because this is an opportunity for them to be outdoors, be on the streets, and occupy the streets in ways that were, the social script was not necessarily allowing them to do? And the nationalist movement becomes an opportunity for women to do something more for themselves and not just for the nation.
And I think some of the most remarkable photos are those where women take over the streets to such an extent that men are quite literally just pushed into the houses, right? It's a complete inversion of what normally would go on in Bombay. And obviously, the earlier photos we have of Bombay as a colonial city, the majority, if not all the actors there are men. And here you have something strikingly different. And not only women, but also the daughters of these women participating also in these demonstrations.
Absolutely. Bombay is a city of men at this point in time. Around there, to every 500 women, there are 1,000 men. So it's a skewed gender ratio. And the history goes back to labor migration, and also, the way in which public space is really coded as masculine back then, but also today. So it's really remarkable. And I can think of the photograph that you're talking about, because there's this image where women are marching on the streets. There's on one side, there's this men of the colonial police force. They're looking at the march, but also on the other side, these nationalist looking men, because they're wearing Gandhi caps. They're sort of running away and making space for the women's march. So yeah, it's a very important, I think, visual testimony of this emergence of this new kind of female political actor.
The other big theme in these photographs, of course, is salt manufacture. Of course, the civil disobedience movement begins with Gandhi's going to the beach in Dandi and taking a fistful of sea salt from the shore. And after that, that prompts repeated action across the country. And I wanted to ask about how the making of salt, which of course is a contraband activity at this stage, became such a central activity in the civil disobedience movement, not only in terms of the ability to break the law, but also the ability for people to be caught at things like photographs doing so. It was a very public demonstration of disobedience. What in particular strikes you about this very public nature of breaking the law that we see taking place in photograph after photograph in the album?
Thanks, Dinyar. I'll take that on because you've asked for, a question about one of my favorite topics. Before I answer the question, I wanted to preface it by saying that one of my key interest points in the Nursi album was really these numerous photographs about salt making, salt raids, salt pan, salt sales, and so on. Because some years ago, and this is when I first began to think about, Gandhi in visual terms, and I was working on my book called Gandhi in the Gallery, I became really interested in how salt, this mundane but life sustaining substance, came to be aestheticized in contemporary artworks and by modern artists. In many cases, it was a corollary to their focus on Gandhi and the Salt March, of course. It's such a recurrent theme in these artworks. But in others, I began to notice that salt qua salt, in and of itself, magically drew the artist's attention and made it to their canvases or to their installation pieces. I remember one which I saw in Delhi where the artist had just put together a mound of salt, and, it was a big Gandhi exhibit. So that is how Gandhi came to be, displaced by a mound of salt. And this really caught my attention, and I think the Mahatma would have agreed with this kind of displacement, given, his investment in this entire project. In the Nursery album, I found photographic precedents to this phenomenon in the way the camera too, turns salt into a visual substance for contemplation. And there are a couple photographs that I, was so drawn to, where even the salt pans come to be aestheticized in this beautiful manner. But of course, this is not the only reason the album is important for any story, I think, about either salt or the salt satyagraha. Picking up on a point that Avrati made, it provides us a visual reminder of something we historians do know about from the documentary record as well, namely the importance of Bombay. I think if Bombay had not stepped up to the plate or to the seashore, this would have remained a rural project, a silly salt stunt, as Irvin famously called it, right? It was the enthusiastic zeal with which these residents of Bombay took to the streets, went to, the seashore and began to do this illicit act publicly and on camera that I think really had a transformative effect on this project and actually made it globally visible too. As you know, this is also the moment, going back to your earlier question, when foreign photographers show up. And part of the reason Gandhi stretched out his march is also to allow the media to show up. And the number of foreign photographers who show up at this moment to capture what is going on in India, from not just the US and Britain, but from Germany too. Walter Bossart comes to mind, on which, colleagues and I did a great project some years ago. His photographs of the salt movement is very interesting. So there's all of this happening around this particular substance, right? And what Gandhi very imaginatively and cleverly, turned into this source of this kind of action. And of course, picking up on the thread of the conversation in the previous question, the centrality of women to all of this, and, the fact that they were prevented from joining the march, but they become absolutely critical to all of this illicit salt making. And the album captures this again and again. I want to turn to an earlier, the irony that they noted of men teaching women how to cook, how to make this salt, which is, of course, a fantastic reversal of what really happens in, domestic settings. But then this is not only reversal, right? I have a section in the book which I call salt lessons. Typically, lessons are about teaching you how to be obedient and, so on. But these salt lessons are about teaching you disobedience, right? And also, very interestingly, picking up on your point about daughters, these photographs show women, children in the company of these women, boys, girls, young teenagers, men and little young boys and girls, accompanying their mothers, grandmothers, perhaps aunts. We don't know what the kinship connections are. The photograph does not tell us that. But it allowed me to think about the disobedient child. And again, this is something in the textual record we hardly encounter. They are not named at all, that the child was there in these salt dramas, a phrase that I love to use because it allows me to, tip my hat to Jim Massalos, the figure of Jim Massalos, who looms over this project, to whom we have dedicated this book as well. So the fact that these children who are, part of these salt dramas, witnessing it, learning their first lessons in how to be nonviolent civil resistors, and also proudly once again posing for the camera, right? It's just amazing. And it's it's the photograph that allows us, I think, to make this new argument. And as you know, the history of the childhood is becoming a really growth field in Indian studies. So I'm really hoping that somebody picks up on this, on the visual archive as well, and really builds up a major argument about the disobedient child.
There's total material, I think, for doing a study on children and photography in India. I mean, we think of some of the most iconic photos of, say, partition, which of course happened a few years later, right? It's of the children who were affected during partition. And that is a good segue to my last question, which concerns violence. These photographs don't just portray Bombay as a city that is, momentarily dominated by women, a city that is engaged in civil disobedience geared towards salt production. It also portrays Bombay as a city convulsed by violence, in the sense that the photographs capture really, in a manner that has not been up until this point captured before, violent clashes between policemen and protesters. And many of these protesters were, of course, women. There are violent tussles between women and policemen on, say, what is today Azad Maidan that are portrayed. Both of you have written about how this shows how British rule was, in some respects, a Lathi Raj. And I wonder if you can talk a bit more about that. I mean, how the photographs capture the complexity of the Lathi Raj. I mean, after all, a lot of these police officers were Indian.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Dinyar. So, yes, the colonial state comes across as a Lati Raj in the photographs of the Nursi album. But violence was, of course, part of the everyday experience of colonial rule. And it only becomes as explicit as it does in the photographs of the Nursi album during these moments of heightened tension or resistance. So, mass protests often led to police brutality, and Bombay's cross racial colonial police force was always on site, ready to charge at peaceful demonstrators. So they're not violent all the time, but they're waiting. So many times in the backdrop, you see a shadow, and then there's a lathi, and you can tell that although there's this magnificent procession taking place, and women are really catching our eye, but there is police presence constantly surrounding them. And the most interesting part about this, I'll address your question in two ways. One is to think about this low ranking native police constable, but also the kind of clashes that the police has with women. And let me start with the police constable first, because it's a very fascinating, interesting figure that I thought comes across in its full kind of historical importance through the pages of the Nursi album. Because we often imagine colonial violence as a confrontation around racial lines, the European colonizer and the colonized native. But these images really foreground this often overlooked figure, which is the low ranking police constable. And the photographs really compelled me to reckon with this figure. And that's what my contribution to the edited volume is about, which are the contradictions that are embodied in his being. So he's simultaneously a representation of colonial power and masculinity on the streets of Bombay in its most pervasive and violent form. Because it's interesting, so many times the most immediate figure and the most familiar figure of colonial authority that people on the streets in the cities, but also some in rural areas, are familiar with is the colonial police. And he's a native figure. And so he's a colonized individual who's deeply embedded at the same time within the social relations of his local mohalla and the city itself. So what we see in these images is that he's chasing nonviolent demonstrators with his lathi raised at the command of his superiors. And the figure is both feared and reviled. But at the same time, there's this promptness with which he's turning violent against his own community and his fellow Indians, which is considered unmanly. Because why are you on the side of the colonial state and not sort of supporting the civil disobedience movement, which is a movement of your own people? So he appears to me as a liminal figure who's caught between these opposing poles of his moral responsibility towards this emergent nation, but also he has a professional obligation towards the colonial state. And the professional obligation comes because of his working class status to some degree. He might have been one of these male labor migrants who've moved to the city, looking for a job, and the only immediate profession or occupation that he could find is at the colonial police force. So he's obligated, because of those duties, to turn violent towards his own people constantly. And the liminality really complicates this understanding of nationalism and colonial violence. But then there are this other side, which is the tension or the friction between women and the colonial police. And there's this amazing set of photographs, which is truly unique and remarkable. I don't think I've seen anything like it otherwise in the textual archive, where you see women caught in this tug of war with colonial police. And what is interesting about these photographs is if you look at these images, it's not the native constable who's fighting these women, who's on the other side of the tug of war. It's the European commanders who often don't get involved in violence. If you look at other images, the person who's always beating the natives or the demonstrators is the local low ranking police officer. But in this particular instance, when they're really tussling over the nationalist flag with women, it's the high ranking European colonial police officer who's involved in the tug of war. And that says something about social relations, says something about the politics of respectability that is involved and the way in which the colonial police treated women. And on the other side, it says something about women's own agency, women's own politics, because they're not supposed to be violent, they're not supposed to be aggressive. And the whole point of Gandhi's call towards women was that, oh, you get involved in leading a civil disobedience because you'll be stoic and nonviolent. And you see them breaking that script again. When the nationalist flag is being taken away from them, they jump into this tug of war, but then politics of respectability keeps the otherwise violent police constable from getting involved. So it's a very complicated set, I would say, of new kinds of social relations being built through the course of the civil disobedience movement, which involves gender, violence, and of course, colonial relations.
Avrati and Sumathi, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to speak to you both.
Thank you, Dinyar. It's been amazing and wonderful conversation. And I've actually already had 2 more ideas that, this project will continue to produce for us. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again. And I'd like to mention to listeners that in case you happen to be in Mumbai, the exhibit Disobedient Subjects runs at CSMBS Museum through the 31st of March, 2026. And any listeners who happen to be in the vicinity of North Carolina, the exhibit over there at the Duke University Center for Documentary Studies runs through the 19th of January, 2026.